Hello? Is this thing on? My name is Bret, and I've been live on the internet for a century now, an actual century. Before there was even YouTube, we were live on YouTube. And if you don't believe that, then hopefully you'll believe the rest of this show, because we're going to be getting into some really cool tech. We've had Jake on the show before, but before we do that, I have to give you all of the stuff that we do here. We're live on Thursdays, usually with Matt, my co-host now, and we talk about containers, DevOps, cloud native, everything. Usually container related because, this channel is called Docker. Duh. But if you haven't watched this live, come back on Thursdays because we take your questions and we give them to the guest. We usually have guests. Sometimes it's just Q&A. Like next week, we'll have just a Q&A show. We even have surprise live streams. I did a live stream on Tuesday. Go check that out on this YouTube channel after we're done with this live stream. It's about DevPod, a new developer container project that I'm excited about that we had Lofts on the show for. But today we're focused on production infrastructure, not dev infrastructure so much, although we might talk a little bit about that. If you didn't know, there's all sorts of other stuff in this community. Over here, we have the DevOps fan server. Over 13,000 DevOps professionals and hobbyists and people learning cloud native, all in a Discord server, chatting and helping each other. So that's the place you should go check out in case you are just curious. It's always busy, and I'm never caught up. There's always conversations happening that I can't keep up with. What else do we also have? We also have a loot box, the store with all the swag for my friends who design shirts for me, and I appreciate them. And these shirts are very cool. We also have mugs, and you'll see all that other stuff, right? It's YouTube, so you see all the stuff you can buy. And what else we got over here? We've got the newsletter. Did you know I send out a weekly newsletter? It's often about what's on this show. So unlike a lot of other newsletters, it is hopefully zero spam and just what I'm creating, what I'm working on, what's on the podcast this week. Yes, we have a podcast too. And what else is going on in my world. Lastly, we're taking now signups, enrollments for my latest course happening in July. This is a live course only, so you have to be there in July. You can sign up now, and this is focused on helping you get your containers into production on Kubernetes using Argo for that new thing we call GitOps, and GitHub Actions, which is my favorite automation platform. So we do a 1-2 punch. It's live. Come join us. People like it, they say, according to the ratings. All right, enough of all that stuff about me. Let's just get to my friends here on the show. We got my co-host, Matt Williams, on the other side of the room. Hello, Matt.
Hello.
And then in the middle there, we have Jake Warner, the CEO and founder of Cycle, or you might know it as Cycle.io. I do say Cycle.io, but technically you're Cycle. We should just say Cycle.
We go by both. I flip it every day.
So we had you on the show 2 years ago, and you were a younger company then, but you've been around almost a decade, right? Like you're about a couple of years away from having your anniversary.
Yeah. This year we turn 8.
Nice.
So
we've
older
been
than
a startup.
For a while.
Yeah, you've been around for a while. And for those that, people saw the ad they're showing up here because they saw the little thumbnail that says Kubernetes and Swarm alternative. And a lot of the people in my community are learning Kubernetes and Swarm. And what is the elevator pitch for a different orchestrator? Like if someone walked up to you and said, I thought I was supposed to, like the industry is telling me to do Kubernetes. I thought I was supposed to do Kubernetes. What would be your elevator pitch for them?
Yeah. So first, I want to take a step back.
Okay.
So I used to only refer to Cycle as a container orchestration platform. And this was until Darren Shepard, as we all know from I was going to say formerly Rancher, but Rancher is technically still around. But there was a point where Darren said, Jake, like you keep talking about this container orchestration side, but the fact that Cycle also does infrastructure management, like that's almost an equally as important story. Like you should tell both of those. So that's the kind of the high level is that Cycle has kind of two components to it. On one side, you have the infrastructure management, which is network management, IP management, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the other side, you have the container orchestration. And so the goal there was that, hey, if we can build both of these things into the same platform, we can greatly simplify the process for companies, right? Instead of you having to figure out like, okay, how am I going, what operating system am I going to use, and how am I going to, keep that operating system up to date, and all the other things that kind of go along with that. And then, of course, doing that across multiple cloud providers or colo regions, etc. So that was one side, and then the container orchestration side was, hey, if we already know that the operating system, the kernel, and all these other things are standardized, great. Can we overlay container orchestration on top of it and make it super easy? So now back to your question of when should yes, Kubernetes is peak hype right now, right? A lot of companies have adopted it, but back in 2015. When Kubernetes and Docker were really going at it, and they kind of both, I don't want to say got released at the same time, but close enough, right? We'll just go with that.
Yeah, sure.
That when I saw these get released, I was sitting there and I was like, this all has the same environment. This environment has the same ingredients for another OpenStack. Right, because I mean, I think all three of us on the call remember the time where, 2010, 2011, everyone was saying, "Hey, if you're not deploying with OpenStack, what are you doing?" Right. No one talks about OpenStack anymore. And so back in 2015 with Docker and Kubernetes, obviously Docker solved some major issues from a local development standpoint, but from a production standpoint, being across multiple servers, etc., that's where there was kind of something missing at that point. And so very simply, all the ingredients were there for Kubernetes to eventually become another OpenStack. And the bet that I made was a decade-long bet that Kubernetes would become kind of that default answer. And then after that, just like with most trends in our industry, people are going to move away from that, hey, I want to be able to customize everything, I want to be able to break everything, et cetera, into a position where people are just going to say, okay, I've had my fun. I just want it to work. Like, I don't care about anything else. I just want it to work. And so that was what Cycle was focused on, was just, hey, how do we build a platform that just works and requires very little setup?
Yeah. It's funny how some of these technologies, like if we look back 30 years, because that's how long I've been doing this, there are such things as too early, right? That happens. And companies sometimes can even fold, and then years later, that thing becomes cool again. And there's sometimes where we have to do a thing in the industry, have to figure out a pattern before we realize that tool we maybe were all using, that we thought we had to use, maybe isn't necessary anymore because we've sort of evolved beyond it or something like that. And you might look at, we had all these other things before containers that did part of what containers is. So I could make an analogy there that, we had, not that LXC isn't still a thing. A lot of these things, they're always a thing after, right? They never really, really go away. I met a guy this week still using OpenStack. They're still fully committed to OpenStack. They deploy OpenStack on-prem for companies. So there are those people. It's not completely dead. But it's it's a sort of a great story over the lifetime of tech. Like, we talk about these decade-long evolutions. I also made a bet on Docker almost a decade ago when I decided my whole career would be on containers at that point. I never had niched before. And here we are still almost 10 years later from Docker's invention. We're still they're still innovating on it. They're still adding functionality. There's still companies being built on the idea of containers. AWS is probably next week going to release another way to deploy containers on AWS. We just had Corey on recently to talk about 20,000 ways you can run containers on AWS. And so I love that anytime I see sort of a cloud platform sort of double down on containers, of course, I'm going to be all in and very interested about that. And I think that's how we originally connected, was realizing that Cycle was betting on containers, but just betting that people didn't want to manage Kubernetes all day and didn't even think that they needed the complexity of Kubernetes all day. Last thing I'm going to say here is that you're now starting to see that trend. I mean, your bet isn't wrong, because we're starting to see all along what I was kind of hoping was the clouds are removing and abstracting away Kubernetes so that you don't have to deal with it. These are sometimes newer ideas on how to run containers, but they also, too, are realizing a lot of people maybe did Kubernetes and didn't need it, or a lot of people don't even need to get involved with Kubernetes. And here we are talking about Cycle.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of big points there. Like again, I mean, Google built Kubernetes for managing internal, or sorry, for like managing YouTube and things like that, like big Google properties. There was never any intention of publicly releasing it until Docker started having the success, and then they're like, all right, let's throw Kubernetes out into the ring. And so, it's just kind of always been amazing that you have all these startups around the world that are like, hey, like, yes, I have the same requirements as Google, I'm building the next YouTube. And they're not, they're building a mobile app or something, right? And so it just kept coming back down to, and like, again, a lot of this came down to my own frustrations. I've been in infrastructure for 17 years now, and there's everyone always has that time where you want to be able to customize and break things and piece back together, but at some point everyone just says, you know what, I don't care about that anymore. I just want it to work, and I want to get back to my own projects. And so that's what Cycle's entire focus has always been on, is just simplifying that process, getting you to 80% as quick as we can. And yeah, that doesn't mean that Cycle is going to be the solution for everyone, right? Like if you are building, some really super highly customized solution, that needs, crazy massive scale, Kubernetes might be the right answer for you, right? But for a huge percentage of the market, that's not true, right? And
Right.
reason people are adopting Kubernetes is because everyone else is talking about it, right? And so, yeah, you had mentioned, that bet looking true. And that is something that over the last 7 months has started to really resonate a lot more. And it was really interesting because 2 years ago, we had companies that, we would be in a conversation with and be like, oh, I love all the value that Cycle provides. I love that I don't have to be in one provider. I love that I don't have to specifically choose AWS or GCP, right? Or if I use both, I have to add extra software to make it happen. I love that I don't need to do that with Cycle. And then, as we were wrapping up the call, they'd say, and so how do I manage the Kubernetes under this? And we're like, Cycle's not built on top of Kubernetes or Docker, like neither. And we would lose deals, right? Companies would say, well, yeah, but we're a Kubernetes organization. We spent a lot of time and money adopting Kubernetes. And it'd be like, well, that sucks. It was great to show you a demo, but it doesn't look like alignment is here. But then you fast forward to today, and those same companies that we were having conversations with 2 years ago are saying, hey, so we were going through the stages of the grief process, right? Like back then we were just kind of in that bargain. Well, sorry, now over the last couple of years, they're like, we went through the bargaining phase where it's like, hey, what if we add an extra layer to this? What if we adopt another Kubernetes wrapper to try to make this simpler, right? Like just trying to take a complex solution and just keep adding band-aids to it to solve the problem. But now enough of these companies are kind of realizing like, hey, if there's this fundamental complexity deep down in the underlying tech, maybe the right solution here is to adopt a different machine. Still be able to run the same containers, right? Because Cycle's OCI compliant, right? So you can still run the same containers, but just not having to adopt this huge burden of technical debt in the process. And so that's where it's exciting is, our sales process has changed significantly from before. It was, okay, let's stand here and try to convince you to go with Cycle versus Kubernetes. And now it's less of that because many of these companies went and ended up opting to try Kubernetes. But now they're coming back and saying, okay, we tried that. It didn't work for us. Now we're here because like this was our backup option. We tried the other one and it didn't solve our problems. And so it puts us in a much better position for having these conversations now because it allows us to really tell our story. And don't get me wrong, there's still some companies that, you still have that back and forth with, and,
Sure.
Kubernetes versus Cycle, but significantly more are saying, hey, we tried that. It didn't work. We're looking for something new.
Yeah. Now, let me back up real quick and test my memory from a couple years ago when you were on. I can deploy on my own infrastructure in the cloud. Is that right?
Yeah.
So Cycle.
Yeah. So Cycle has a couple of kind of like foundational primitives built onto it. A couple of different like primary ideas that the entire platform was based off of. Number one is that all of our customers should own their infrastructure. They should own their data. They should own their networks. That's number one. Number two is that everything should be automatically updatable. Because if you are a company that adopts, if you're a company that adopts a platform that requires you to manually update it, at some point someone's going to say, you know what, I don't care about updating this anymore, and it's going to fall behind, right? It's like Datadog did a report back in, I believe it was 2021, where at the time the report said that the average version of Kubernetes that was deployed at that time for production was 18 months out of date.
Yeah.
And you have to imagine
Probably
that,
worse
kind of
now.
fast forward now, it's probably
Yeah.
worse, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's the neat thing about Cycles. There's thousands of servers connected to the platform today, and they're all running a build that we pushed out, I think, the third week of April. And so there's no such thing as legacy code in our platform, and that allows us to iterate really quickly. Again, we're 8 years into this now, and we've been able to, we've gotten into a position where we can push these updates on average every 2 to 3 weeks and not yield downtime in the process, right? And at first, people were saying like, "Ooh, I'm terrified of you automatically updating my infrastructure." 8 years later, we've kind of gotten it down to a science at this point. So it's much less of a scare than it used to be.
Yeah, I can imagine that. I would be nervous too at first, but with time and I was also nervous about my Tesla getting updates all the time, and thought that, what if I can't drive in the morning because it broke in the middle of the night? But that hasn't happened, so I'm also no longer caring about it.
Bricking a 4-ton vehicle.
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, didn't you say that you guys distribute your own OS as a part of it? If I remember, is that right? Like your own AMI or?
Correct. And so one of the ways the Cycle makes kind of approaches things a bit differently is that we never install the operating system to disk. Every time a server turns on, it pulls the operating system from our core.
Okay.
And so it's an 80 megabyte operating system. And it's made to do almost nothing. Like, all of the actual heavy lifting happens after after the operating system starts, and it pulls down the latest version of the compute layer that needs to run on that server, right? So the operating system, our goal is to make it, how dumb can we make this operating system so that way, like, it has such a limited attack surface. It's very easy to update. Like, I mean, it does almost nothing.
Right.
All the heavy lifting has been pushed, into the container layer, which allows us to have those automatic updates and things like that. But the reason we did that, and again, this is another one of those things where back in, when we launched Cycle, when we started bringing customers on in 2018, people were saying like, that's a weird approach. Why would you do that? I don't like that. That's not traditional. And now it's, started really gaining a lot of respect for our product. But the reason we did it that way is, again, one of those core principles of the product is that it needs to be able to be fully updated automatically. And if you wanted to, automatically update, Docker Swarm or Kubernetes, like, to meaningfully update it, there's a lot of questions that, an update script or whatever you want to call it would have to ask, like, what operating system am I on? Is that operating system, what version of that operating system what dependencies are installed? Like, there's, all these 1,000 little variables that you need to consider. And maybe part of an update script does not know those, right? Like, how often do people right now, I mean, even installing Docker on a Mac, right? Like, if you look at the GitHub threads for issues on installing Docker on like an M1 or M2, how many people are like, oh, it's broken right now, like, I can't do builds anymore. Like, there's just so many questions around, like, when you have to support so many different operating systems and so many different variables, you end up in a situation where it's very hard to test every single variable. And so Cycle's whole approach was, for us to reliably push updates to all of our customers, we need to know all the variables from day one. Right. And so that's where having this operating system with the standardized kernel, with, all of these things, we immediately can make the assumption that regardless of what that underlying customer is doing, whether they're, doing AI stuff or real estate stuff or building a fintech platform or whatever they're building on top of Cycle, we at least know that the underlying infrastructure is fully standardized. And that's kind of our moat around our product, because to make that decision, that's like a fundamental decision you have to make when you're building it, as opposed to kind of going back in time and saying, well, now I'm going to add automatic updates. Much harder to do when there's a lot of discrepancy amongst variables already.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think back to, like, historically, wasn't that also the benefit of CoreOS? It was at the kind of at the core, it was this limited operating system, and then a lot of the stuff happened in containers. I think they got acquired by Red Hat at some point, but
Yep.
wasn't that what they were doing as well? Oh, and what was the timeline for? Oh, was
Yeah.
CoreOS already doing that, or?
CoreOS and Cycle were actually being built at the same time.
Okay.
Cycle was probably about a year and a half behind, but Cycle took a
Hmm.
slightly different approach, right? With CoreOS, like yes, they had the OS layer, um, but with Cycle we took a kind of a platform approach, right? So like we manage all of the APIs, we manage all the build systems, we manage all the portals and everything. So that way, these are things that our customers
Mm,
don't even have to worry about, right? The only thing that our customers run and maintain is the compute layer. Or sorry, not even maintain. It's
mm,
just that's what's running on their servers. Everything else, all job scheduling, all DNS, everything else runs on our
right.
infrastructure. So that way it makes it super easy again to get to that 80% as fast as you can. And it
Cool.
makes it so that our customers don't have to run as much infrastructure, right? And you don't have to worry about running something in HA because like in terms of even cycle services, and I can share my screen here and pull up our status page. And so on our status page, we have these are the different services that make up Cycle's core. And one of the neat things about Cycle, and I think this is something that we talked about on the last time I was on your show. Was the fact that I think that failover is a terrible idea. And we had a whole conversation about
Yep.
how bad failover can be. And so this is kind of aligned with that same strategy. Is we have these services that make up Cycle, but Cycle has a number of native integrations to AWS, GCP, etc. And we run our core across every provider that we support. So that way, if AWS were to go down or GCP were to go down or whatever, our core is still up, right? We haven't had a minute of downtime for the platform since the platform went live, pretty much. And so that's kind of the difference between CoreOS and Cycle is it's more of a platform approach where CoreOS was more of a, hey, we're going to standardize the OS, but you still have to maintain all these other components in the process as well.
Right. If I'm remembering that conversation correctly, that was talking about you prefer active active rather than active passive, right? That's what you're talking about.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Because us, the three of us, and probably most people watching, being in infrastructure for a long time, we all know that like, hey, you can design the world's best failover process, right? You set it up, but then 2 years from now, like who's sitting there testing this failover process over and over
Right.
and over, right? Most of the time, don't get me. Some companies do it great. Some companies do it well, but most companies, once it's up and running, the developers moved on to something else, and they don't even really think about it anymore. So then, when something does inevitably fail 3 years down the road, the failover process doesn't happen, and it's because no one's put any
Right.
time into
You,
maintaining it.
you paid
And
all
so
this
Cycle's
money and the thing doesn't even work.
exactly right.
Yeah.
And so Cycle's entire philosophy around failover is if something is important enough to you, run it multiple times. And Cycle's entire, like everything is built around that idea, right? So if you go into Cycle and say, hey, this is an application, I need to run it, it's stateless and I need to make it highly available, great. It will do the things that need to happen to make sure that it's running active in multiple geographic regions or across multiple providers, the things that are needed for that. That way, if something goes wrong, um, sorry, if by taking that approach and having active, if something's fundamentally wrong with your application, you're going to know about it at that moment, as opposed to later in the middle of the night when someone tells you that something's wrong, right? It's just a much more reliable approach. But at the same time, if something does go wrong, like you have an outage that in affecting one provider, for a fact it's still going to all that traffic is still going to continue to be able to hit your application because it is active.
Right. I kind of want to see a demo.
Well, one question I have about the active, I looked at the pricing page and I saw that for businesses that are adopting this, it seems pretty fair pricing, affordable pricing for most businesses that are going to rely on this kind of stuff. But and then there was also a free option, but in all the active kind of configuration, that's only in those kind of business options, those higher priced options. Is that correct?
That is technically correct, right? Our free plan allows only people to connect one server. It's kind of one of those like, hey, like you can play with us from a personal standpoint, right? But if you're
Yep.
running any sort of application that needs HA, like at least upgrade
Yeah.
to our light plan.
Yeah.
We save our average customer $300,000 a year, so it's like paying for the light
Yeah.
plan is like it's a checkbox, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So you said, Bret, you said you wanted to see a demo. All right. So.
Well, I
can
couldn't remember if we
definitely do
did a
that.
demo last time, so I thought well,
I think
maybe
we
this
did, but
time we take a look.
The platform has gotten significantly better since then, so we can definitely dive into that.
All right.
All right. So before we dive in too much, one thing that I want to kind of state for everyone kind of viewing this, don't judge too much on the interface. This is an interface that was originally built back in 2018. It's had a lot of features added to it over time. This is still what our customers are using, but we have a new portal that we're going to be launching in June. That we're really excited about. It takes a much more kind of a modern take on some of these interfaces as opposed to the current portal. I can bring up a quick snapshot of what the beta kind of look of this new portal is. There's a lot of things that we're rolling out in it, but we're expecting to take this live in 2 to 3 weeks from now. But let's jump back to the existing portal, given this is what our customers are using today. So a couple of things that I want to immediately kind of draw attention to. So this is a development account that we have up and running. Within this account, we have 4 servers. So we have 2 servers over on Vultr. We have another server over on AWS, and we have a 4th server over on GCP. So right off the bat, the whole story of, hey, Cycle does not require you to choose just one provider. You can have multiple at the same time. You can mix and match. You can say, hey, I want to use cloud, and I also want to use colo. You can use virtual machines and bare metal. Cycle does a really good job of kind of taking all that infrastructure and making it almost like a single pool of resources. Granted, you can subdivide that further if you care to, but by default, everything Cycle looks at these as just a single pool of resources. So that's number one. The second thing that I want to draw your attention to is this version number, and this is similar to what we were talking about earlier, where one of the core components of Cycle is that it needs to be able to be automatically updated. So in this case, this was a build that was deployed on May 12th. So 5 or 6 days ago. I don't know the date. Just again, immediately kind of helps users know that everything is aligned. In terms of deploying infrastructure, Cycle makes that super easy. Users can go over into infrastructure, go into providers. In this case, for this account, I already have our main native integrations configured. If I didn't, you'd just be able to drop your API key into AWS or Vultr or Equinix Metal, Google Cloud. Those are our 4 native providers. But we also, back in November, added support for what we call our infrastructure abstraction layer. And our infrastructure abstraction layer allows companies to integrate with Cycle. Allows companies to run Cycle anywhere that they would like. So if you have, a rack of servers in your closet, you could connect and manage those with Cycle as well. And that's where we talk about Cycle having those kind of 2 sides. One side being infrastructure management, and the other side being container orchestration. But once we have these providers configured, we can go back to servers. We can add a server. Or I guess actually before I do that, 1 second, our VPN is not having a fun time. Let me refresh that. Live demos are always fun.
Always. It's all we do. We only do live.
So we have these 4 servers, as I mentioned before. If we want to click into any of them, we can see load averages, RAM usage, storage usage, etc. Right, like just kind of that high level telemetry information about each of these servers. But if we wanted to go ahead and deploy more infrastructure, we can go to servers over up here in the right hand corner. So I'm kind of zooming around. We'll click add servers. And then here we can choose a provider that we want to add from our supported providers. So let's say we wanted to do Google Cloud. We can choose a region that we want to deploy into. So I'm in Reno, Nevada. So let's go ahead and we'll choose Las Vegas. Click next. And Cycle will automatically pull in the list of all of the servers that we can deploy into that region from AWS and the prices for that server. Granted, this does not include the sustained usage discounts that GCP gives, but that's okay. Suppose we wanted to deploy 2 of these and 1 of these. We can come over here. We can see where they're at. If we wanted to customize the availability zone, we could do that as well. We'll leave it as auto for now. And then we could choose what cluster we want to put it into. So clusters within Cycle are Cycle's way of isolating infrastructure. So that way you can have a development cluster and a production cluster, and the applications and environments and networks, etc., that are running on top of those clusters. They won't, Cycle will not allow those to intermingle. So that way you have true separation of kind of concerns. If you want to create your own cluster, you can. You can create as many clusters as you want. There's no limitation on those. Below that, you'll see the cost for deploying that infrastructure at the provider that you selected, and then your cost for how much this would impact your bill over at Cycle. And so you can see that's because the specific plan I'm on allows me to deploy up to 15 servers. So because we already have infrastructure up and running, I'm not going to deploy any extra infrastructure. But if I wanted to, sorry, the button's down here. If I wanted to deploy this infrastructure, I click the button. It will deploy that infrastructure over into my GCP account, and there's no extra customization that I need. I don't need to log into any of these servers, set up SSH keys, set up authorization, do any updates. Cycle takes care of everything. I can immediately go from these servers being deployed to deploying deploying containers to them. We'll go ahead and close this interface. Once we have those servers online, users will spend most of their time over in the environment screen. And so environments are where, so each environment is a private network that spans all of the infrastructure within a cluster, right? So in this case, we have 4 different environments. They're sharing the same underlying infrastructure, but they are truly separated from a network perspective, from a resource perspective, et cetera, et cetera. So it makes it super easy to get better density on infrastructure. And this is one of the big things that we've had companies reaching out to us for as of recent, is companies are saying, hey, with Kubernetes and some of these other platforms we're using, just the way that we've been deploying applications, we're in a position where we might have some of these servers that are using only 30% of their resources. How can we focus on getting more density and utilization out of this underlying infrastructure? So that way, instead of counting pennies by adopting a model where we're starting and stopping servers nonstop, we're just saying, hey, overall, we're going to run less servers. And so that's something that Cycle puts a lot of effort into, is emphasizing that better utilization of the underlying infrastructure. Sorry, I guess before I keep moving, any questions, Bret, Matt, that I can dive into, or anyone in the live chat?
Not for me yet.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, not for me yet. But I was noticing this VPN network one.
Yeah, Lee asked, is this a VPN network within the cluster?
So it is a VXLAN network. It is a global L2 network per cluster. Sorry. It is a global L2 network per environment, and then each of these environments is within a cluster. So it's not a network at the cluster level, but it's a network at the environment level. Each of those networks is automatically fully encrypted. Cycle takes care of configuring all IPsec for all those networks. So even if your traffic is going from AWS to GCP or vice versa, all that traffic, even though it's on the same L2 network, will be fully encrypted. That being said, Cycle does something also kind of magical, maybe not magical, but really neat, is that when it goes through that process of building these networks, it actually runs a number of tests to see if that network is using an out-of-band connection or a direct connect. And if there's a direct connect available, Cycle will default to all traffic to that. So that way, you don't even have to tell it all these extra variables about, like, hey, if there's a direct connect, go use that. Cycle will figure it out on its own. So it makes it super easy. Just if you need to have a high bandwidth pipe between different providers that is technically out of band, you have that ability, and Cycle just fully configure it to that.
Is there a latency requirement for the nodes inside of one of these environments?
Nope. No, Cycle's built to take any dumb compute and be able to run on top of it. Now, obviously, if your underlying application requires a low latency, that's your application. But from a Cycle perspective, there are no requirements. Let me rephrase. Reasonable network, right? But we don't require a super low level, a super low latency setup.
Yeah, I know that generally, I've heard the number for Kubernetes be 100 milliseconds maximum between nodes, which is usually why we want everything in one region. I know with Swarm, ideally it's down at 10 to 20 milliseconds, simply because of the way that the algorithm for the control plane works and how it is very gossipy and there's a lot of high low latency traffic necessary to make sure that your managers for your clusters are in sync. But
And
a lot of times people want to go across. There's a common question of how do I go across region? How do I go across cloud provider? How do I go hybrid? And to my knowledge, like the model for those type of orchestrators is that you make multiple clusters and then you use some higher plane of abstraction in order to connect them with load balancing and stuff like that. It becomes a harder. We didn't solve this in the orchestrator problem. So I'm curious how your customers use the environments and how they go across region or across cloud.
Well, and you hit actually a number of really big, kind of points there. So number one, to your first point is, why these other platforms require low latency, as we talked about, 2 or 3 minutes ago, as we talked about 2 to 3, or I guess longer than that. But we talked about how there's the platform approach here, right, where our customers are only running compute, and then we as a company are running the underlying core. So as you're talking about that low latency, that's a problem that we get to solve for you, because all of the job scheduling and stuff happens on our infrastructure, right? That way our customers, they're just getting the instructions of what they need to do. All the actual everything else happens on our core. And then that being said,
so what you're saying is the control plane that we all think of it traditionally with Kubernetes and Swarm, you're the control plane. So it's not like the customer's control plane is on their infrastructure in the cloud they chose. It's wherever your control plane's at.
Exactly. And our control plane is scaled across all those providers, but we've gone through the extra stuff and the extra efforts to make everything super reliable and super fast for that environment. Or sorry, I don't want to use environment because that's a different term in this case, but for the core, we've gone through all the extra work to be able to obtain that. But that makes it super easy for our customers, because as long as Cycle can communicate with their compute infrastructure, they're just pretty much getting just basic instructions. Now, one of the reasons Cycle is called Cycle is that every 10 minutes, every node connected to the platform will download a manifest. And that manifest gives that server every instruction it could ever need to maintain state. That way, if that server could not talk back to Cycle's core for whatever reason, it still knows exactly what its role is, exactly what it needs to do. And suppose you had a container fail, or a restart issue, or a health check failed or something like that, that server knows how to handle that without ever talking back to Cycle's core, because of that manifest. And so one of the things that people kind of notice about the company very quickly is that we are a hope for the best, plan for the worst kind of approach to just about everything. And so that assumes the whole idea of, what if our core goes down? What if something really, really bad happens? Even though our core is spread across AWS, GCP, and 3 other providers, what if it does go down? Granted, if Cycle's core entirely goes down, I think we as a society probably have a bigger problem at this point, given that it was built the way it was. But we just still wanted to be able to say, like, hey, maybe there's a network issue between where your stuff is running and Cycle. So maybe Cycle's not down, but your stuff can't talk back to Cycle because who knows, something's wrong. That's where that manifest really comes into play and keeps things aligned. So that was number one. And then the other thing that you'd mentioned, I don't remember it anymore, though. there's two really good points that you made.
We'll come back to it. Mark has a question. What about DNS for container-to-container resolution? I guess that's one question. And then any notion of namespaces, which I guess those are related, like a DNS namespace. What's that like?
Yeah, so actually, I'll click into one of these. So if we have this list of environments here, I'll zoom in again. We'll click into this production environment, and you can see that within this production environment, we have this discovery service. This discovery service, which runs per environment, handles all DNS resolution, per environment. And so if we want to make this HA, why not? This is dev cluster anyway. We can make that H8, and now when we click into that discovery process, we can see Cycle started three discovery process, or sorry, Cycle started three different discovery instances. So that way, even in terms of a DNS resolution perspective, now that has become HA. Granted, we have two on this Vultr server. I don't know why that happened, but I'm guessing that's because we manually moved an instance during a previous demo, and that is why that happened. But that is how Cycle takes care of that. Is all containers within an environment resolve back to the local discovery service within that environment. And then public DNS, because we do public DNS as well, you just have to point a domain to ns1 through ns4.cycle.io. You can configure your domain here. So like we have like the centerofrain.com, which is our only real domain here. If we add a new record, we have your traditional record types, but we also have a linked record, which is something that we've built internally. A linked record is your way of saying, hey, this domain, if we do, Bret, and we say we want to hit the production environment, and let's say we wanted to hit this API docs container. I no idea what it is, but whatever. And we can generate a TLS certificate as well. So now instead of having to sit here and configure IP addresses and A records and things like that, we're just telling Cycle, hey, anytime someone hits bret.thescentofrain.com, which by the way, thescentofrain.com is Petrichor. If you've ever heard the term Petrichor, that's our legal company name. And so that's what Petrichor means. It's just the Center of Rain. But if anyone were to hit bret.thecentofrain.com, it would figure out how to make it hit this container, even if that's load balanced, even if that's running across multiple providers, etc. It just makes it super easy. And then again, in this case, Cycle's also going to generate a TLS certificate for that container. And so right now it's generating, and this is not a non-hosted zone, so that will never generate. But that would be the process in terms of getting public DNS to a container as well.
All right. Moz has a question. Does Cycle help with migration from one cloud provider to another?
What a great question. I love that. So if we go into containers, actually, let's go fix that issue that we previously had. So we'll go into discovery here. We'll go into instances, and how I mentioned that there was one discovery service running over Vultr, two running at Vultr and one running at GCP. Let's say, hey, that's not what we want. We want to run it. We want one running over at AWS as well. We can come over here, and there's a migrate instance button. We'll click that. We'll zoom out a little, come down, choose that AWS server in that same region, and let's click move instance. And there we go. So now, I'm guessing we might be out of capacity on that server. Oh, it's because I tried to move the discovery service. It'll start again in a second. There we go. So that's how we moved from one instance, we moved this one instance from Vultr, this instance from Vultr over to AWS. And again, this is a stateless instance, but if it was a stateful instance, like if we go back to discovery, if we go back to the environment here, we have this DB test. So this is a MySQL container. We can see that this container has a volume attached to it. It's 201 megs of 2.6 gigs total. If we go ahead and move this, let's say we want to move it from AWS over to Vultr, you'll see that because it's stateful, this option appears where we can say, hey, we want to migrate the contents as well. And so if we do that move, Cycle will start up that new instance, and it'll begin that migration. But because it was stateful, Cycle says, hey, we're going to keep that old data there. We're going to keep that old instance there for up to 3 hours, just in case you ever decide that you want to undo what you just did. Then all you have to do is click this revert migration button, and Cycle will revert back to how it was before the migration. Again, the whole hope for the best, plan for the worst. But one of the neat things about this process here is that we're doing a byte-by-byte copy. So it's not like we built a local file, use more disk space. Like if we had a server that had 20 gigs of storage capacity and 19 were full, we could still do that migrate because it's that byte for byte, as opposed to doing like a local dump, compressing it, zipping it, and then moving it, where you might not have enough capacity on that server to do that. So we see here that the migration is finishing. This green circle shows that the container is currently starting. I'm guessing that this is the first time we're actually starting this image on the server, so it takes a little bit longer. And in a second, there we go. There's our MySQL database running on Vultr instead of AWS. And in a second, we'll see that volume appear with the underlying data. It says up to 15 seconds, but that's actually closer to like a minute. But that's the process of migrating.
So in that process, we saw that we might want to roll back. And I guess that's because maybe we saw a performance decrease on the new platform, perhaps. How would we determine that? Would we be using just metrics that we see inside a cycle, or do we also use something like a Datadog or other platform?
So Cycle's monitoring. So right now, Cycle does have some base telemetry stuff. I guess telemetry has been disabled for this instance. Again, this is our development cluster, so it's all over the place in terms of where things are at. We'll click another instance. Here we go, and then we'll connect to the. Oh, it's disabled there as well. Our team really went to town with disabling things. We'll jump into this load balancer, and we'll connect to the telemetry there. So Cycle does have. Give it a second. There you go. Cycle does have, like general or RAM. Sorry, Cycle does have telemetry information per instance on the platform, and you can configure all the different criteria here. You can you can capture telemetry down to the per second, and then you can actually put in the webhook. So you can say, hey, every time we take a telemetry snapshot, send it off to something else. So if you need to make external decisions. But one of the things that I really appreciate as well is this is all a WebSocket. So I'm going to refresh this page. I'll zoom in a little so it makes it easier for people to see. And so we have the console, and nope. Here. It's still connecting. There we go. And so as we go back to the stream now, we can see that this is all the different telemetry information that you can pull. And because we're connected to that socket, if you need to, get really, into like really intricate, detail usage and stuff about that container, you absolutely can. So we do have some companies that actually connect to this and then pipe that information into Datadog. But we are also rolling out a monitoring solution. It'll be in the new portal as one of the like primitive options over here. So that way you can have a single dashboard that is kind of a high level look at how everything is running. But the whole goal of Cycle is to give all of our customers the things that they need to really get started, but still open the doors so that if someone wants to use Datadog or some other product to connect to things, they absolutely can. Our goal is not to lock anyone out of anything, but just to give you the base tools that you need to get started.
All right, we have a bunch of questions coming in. Mark's got another one. Deploying without ClickOps. Is that an option? I guess like infrastructure as code.
Yep. So obviously, for the demo, we're in the interface because it's a lot less fun to demo an API. We do have a full API that so the average flow for our customers today is working the UI to kind of get a feel for the platform. One of the common issues that we have with Cycle is that if someone's coming to Cycle from Kubernetes or from Docker Swarm, they will start making assumptions of what they need to do versus what they actually need to do. And so they'll almost end up creating problems just because they're like, oh, I need to go allocate an IP subnetwork. It's like, you don't need to do that. And they're like, oh, I need to go create a Docker network or things like that. You don't need to do that either. An environment automatically does that. So people usually will start within the UI. They'll get comfortable with the platform. And then after they get comfortable with it, then they'll switch over to using our API. And our API is full featured. Our portal is a direct consumer of our own API. But the big news is that we are going to be launching a CLI. We'll be launching it in beta at the end of June, and then we're expecting production ready launch will be end of July, early August. And so we're expecting that to really start streamlining a lot of those processes where someone wants to use that CLI within GitHub Action and things like that. And then at the same time, we do have pipelines. It is in beta in this current portal, new portal. We've revamped it almost entirely. But pipelines are for people who want to create automated processes within the platform where they can say, hey, every time there's a commit to our master branch, automatically, do A, B, and C. And so I guess very simply, there's a number of different answers. A number of different ways to automate things. It all depends on what that company wants to do.
Yeah, I mean, my follow-up question for that would be, if I have a team of 3 people that all have write access to my infrastructure, how do I audit that? How do I ensure that things are improved or reverted? I mean, in my community, it's all infrastructure as code and GitOps approaches where we pull requests in Git are how we gate things and approve things. And I was just curious if you had some anything in the portal that would help us with that.
So we do have audit logs and things like that. In terms of like what is being accepted as infrastructure as code is one of the places where Cycle's still a little weak. And being able to have those pipelines in a position where you're able to approve something before it goes to the next step, right? Things like that. That's not implemented at this time. We've started getting requests for it recently, and so it's on the roadmap, but it's not in the platform today. But most companies are taking that approach using like per environment, right? So they'll have a pipeline where per developer they will have a new environment that will spin up on top of that existing infrastructure where they do all the testing, et cetera, and then they'll have an admin or whoever is the responsible party in charge that once they have a build ready to take to production, we'll take care of that action. Because like within Cycle, you do have role-based controls and things like that, but a lot of it comes down to kind of the building blocks that we offer. We've noticed that a lot of different companies take those blocks and kind of piece them together in different ways. So there's a lot of different things that kind of come into play there. One of the things that is helping us get to this GitOps and kind of rainbow deployment approach is that we have been building our own load balancer for the last few months. Because like right now, our load balancer is built on top of HA proxy, which everything else in Cycle is connected very deeply, right? And so it's hard to have a load balancer that is not that same way and does not allow us to kind of ask it the questions real time that we want to be able to ask it, or give it commands without having a stop the world event in the middle, right? So we're about 45 days away from launching our own load balancer that will allow us to do rainbow deployments. So that way you can say, hey, this is a development environment. Here's a staging environment, here's a production cluster, and you can just route traffic based off of, you could even potentially do it by IP. You could say, hey, if this IP, is having a request in the load balancer to this URL, point them to the development cluster. So that way, if you have a dev team that's hitting from a VPN, you could do things like that way. Or eventually being able to set up canary deployments where you say, hey, this is the new version of our application. Over the next 4 hours, slowly increase the number of people who are hitting it. But if you ever get more than a 2%, 404 rate or 500 rate or whatever, automatically fail back to the previous version or point the traffic back to the previous version. So there's a lot of things that this load balancer will allow us to do that we have not been able to do yet with HA proxy. And that's where auto scaling will get a lot easier. That's where rainbow deployments will get a lot easier, canary deployments. And so we're particularly excited for that, but that's about 45 days away.
All right. Another question from Lee. Are those volumes multi-instance or container attachable, replication, etc.? I guess maybe dive in a little bit to the volume storage scenarios.
Yeah, so we took a very opinionated approach on volumes. We made them very basic, very fundamental. They're LVMs, so they're direct LVMs, so they're very, very fast. But they're all local to the server that they're on. The platform does not do any replication in terms of the volumes itself, which I've always thought when platforms are like, hey, we're going to automatically replicate your data and stuff. It's kind of weird, right? Like there's a reason that like MongoDB and all these database technologies have the replication built inside of them. They know, like MongoDB knows how to replicate that data in a safe way. Having a platform do it is kind of weird. So Cycle's approach is storage should be fast and it should be reliable. but we as a platform do not make assumptions about how that data should be replicated. We let the underlying applications take care of that. And so, yeah.
When you did that migration, that I'm trying to remember, that included that example you gave earlier. That included the data. Like you had that little
Yeah.
checkbox?
So yeah, sorry. We will move the data, but we will not live replicate it. Right. Like
Okay.
we will move it and we will do backups of it, but we will not say like, hey, we're gonna have 2 copies of this data at the same time. Like that is up to your application. Like there's no reason you can't run like 2 Mongo instances and then have them doing a data replication. But we as a platform, there's there. I've been in infrastructure too long to to see again, there's a reason all these database technologies have replication built into them. Having a platform try to do that is just you're playing with fire.
Yeah, sure. I think part of it's too, like you mentioned backups, but to a lot of people, like they want to know all the features of your backups and how often and how do you recover and all that stuff.
Yeah, backups are actually really neat with the platform. So if we go into a container here, if we go into that same database container that we migrated, we can go to config, integrations, and then backups. And so in this case, this server is configured to use Backblaze for the actual backup destination. But this is the backup command. And so we're saying, hey, MySQL dump, and it's actually going to output this to standard output, right? And we're saying, hey, run this daily and give it 900 seconds to run. So it's actually, the way we implemented backups is really neat. So instead of you backing up to a file, the entire way that Cycle does backups is output it to the standard output for this specific command. We will capture that and move it over to your storage provider in 25 megabyte chunks, and then we'll chunk it all together over there into a single file. But that way, similar to what we said before, if you have a server that only has 10 gigabytes worth of total disk. I mean, that's a very small server, but whatever, we'll go with it. Suppose you have 10 gigabytes of total disk and you have 9.5 gigabytes used. There's no way you're going to back up that 10 gigs to that server to push it somewhere else. So Cycle does this in a really neat way where we in chunks we'll push it over to that provider, and then the restore is the same thing. We're saying, hey, where's the command, and we're going to read from the standard input. So we're just going to pipe that input from your backup directly back into the container, so that way we're not using any extra disk space as part of that backup or restore process. So it makes it really cool. And the nice thing is, like, if you want to back up a directory, great, tar it and output that tar to tar it, gzip it, and output that to your standard output. So you can. So this just gives our users the ability to back up anything. Like, we don't have to build all these fancy integrations. As long as you can put the command in and you can output the standard output, great, you can back up anything. And we can make it so that way, again, we're doing that byte by byte copy, as opposed to any extra, like, really fancy backup process.
Very cool. Last question here. Mark's asking about cluster auto scaling. So I presume we're talking about. There's many types of auto scaling. So node auto scaling or container auto scaling. Workload auto scaling.
So Cycle has all of the pieces of scaling. Scaling on Cycle is super easy. The part that Cycle does not have today is the auto. Now, we do have some companies that have implemented their own auto scaling on top of Cycle. Again, the API calls to scale are actually very fundamental and foundational to the platform. But we don't have the auto scaling stuff. Similar to what I was talking about earlier with HA proxy, if getting that kind of real time information to be able to make decisions off of it, there's ways to do it, but it would have been a hack. Doing it with doing it with our own load balancer will give us, like, real-time metrics where the compute server itself can kind of give suggestions back to the platform, as opposed to the platform having to ask everything constantly over and over and over again, like, should I auto scale? We want everything in Cycle is push based. And so we didn't want to introduce polling based kind of auto scaling where we're just kind of looking at things nonstop. We want things to tell us when they think we should auto scale, or at least give us a suggestion of, hey, we're seeing latency increase. We're seeing, RAM usage start to, skyrocket. These are events that we should trigger an event to at least look for an auto scale, without having to constantly just sit there and just over and over and over and over kind of do a pool or a sample of all available telemetry at that point in time. But again, we've had companies that have built autoscaling on top of Cycle. We just don't have it as a platform, feature at this point.
So it sounds like there's a number of things in the pipeline. Like you're talking about a CLI later this year, a new dashboard interface later this year, a new load balancer thing you're working on. What's that?
So was that?
And they're all coming in June.
No, so a number of these things have been in development, kind of simultaneously, right? So Portal's coming in June, CLI Beta's coming in June, and then load balancer we're expecting end of June, early July. So a lot of these have been in development for months now, and it is kind of just correlating all roughly at the same time. So June and July will be a big month for the company.
Nobody's taking vacation in June.
I mean, when things have already been in work for months, right? Like it's like, and again, like the neat thing is that because we don't have legacy code to maintain, and things like that, and since we're able to push out these updates, it allows us to be a lot more reliable with getting new features out. And again, I mean, certain like the load balance will be marked as beta, right? And so our it would have to be opt-in per environment for our customers, because again, you don't want load balancing you don't want to go from like, hey, here's a fully production tested load balancer to here's a new load balancer and just force that on all of our users. So there'll be opt-in for some of those for a number of those things.
All right. How do people get started? Is there I mean, obviously we got the sign up on the website. You said you could do like a single environment for free, I think, or like a single server or something.
Yeah. So to get started, so back in January, we closed up our sign up process. So it used to for years we allowed anyone to create an account, but the problem is that the first step in creating an account is you have to put in an API key. And we had a lot of people saying like, well, I don't know if Cycle is going to solve my problem. I'm not going to put in an API key and connect it to my infrastructure. So back in January, we closed up our sign up process and forced everyone into a demo flow. So to get an account, you have to talk with someone. You have to talk with someone on the team. But the nice thing about that is, if we schedule a 20-minute call with someone, and we can just have a conversation, be like, hey, what are you looking to get out of this? What problems are you trying to solve? And then very quickly we can say, hey, we can actually give them kind of a plan of, hey, here's how you should solve this with Cycle, right? And just by closing that sign up process back in January and having conversations with people who are interested in using the platform, I mean, the relationships that we're building with new users to the platform now is just so fundamentally better, just because that initial conversation gives both parties, a chance to say, hey, here's how I can help you, or here's my problem. So yeah, I mean, creating, going to Cycle, creating, you can click sign up, and then you're just putting in your information. There is a demo process, and there is a demo schedule form. Once that demo schedule form goes out, if someone is like really super adamant, like if anyone watching this who's kind of already seen a demo, is like, hey, like I saw the Bret Fisher podcast, I just went in, I've seen the demo, let us know and we'll respond and we'll just we'll just approve your account immediately. Like if someone's super adamant about not seeing a demo, we'll let them in. But it just gives us an extra opportunity to have that conversation.
Right. I'm imagining the show shut up and take my money approach. Yeah. The one thing I was thinking about was when I lost it. Never mind. It'll come back to me. You have a fan in chat that wants to see more of the new UI. So is this like under like where customers can't see it? So now for people to see the new UI, they have to
yeah, they'll have to watch the show. But yeah, so this is the new UI. Again, this is not none of our users right now can access this. This is just fully internal. You can see, like, I mean, object to object, right? Like, I mean, it still needs some love, but it's coming along, right? But yeah, so this is the new UI. You can see that we've introduced kind of the side menu across everything. One of the common questions that we were getting from people was, hey, if I'm inside an environment or inside a server, can you make it easier for me to jump to another server without having to jump back to the server's list every single time, right? So we implemented this kind of secondary navigation across anything that has sibling components. And again, I've shrunk my screen a little bit for the demo, but again, it just makes it easy to see kind of the metrics behind, or sorry, to see where each of these servers is, be able to click through them very quickly. So it looks still very similar to the old way that we did things, but with a much more modern take for some of it. And then the new portal's significantly faster. So if we jump into environments, again, that same thing for where even if I'm in this production environment now, I can still see the states of the other environments and the containers within that environment. I can click into containers here and see, okay, so here's, again, same thing as before, but if I jump into like API docs, we've rebuilt this interface so it's a little bit cleaner as well. So we have our dashboard instances. Again, still need some love, but that's where kind of the approach that we're taking with things. So it's a little bit. We didn't really have many complaints about the old portal, so our goal was not to fundamentally change everything, right? Because don't change what's not broken. But we also wanted to be able to kind of just give it a refresh and solve some of the kind of basic problems that we knew existed, but we're not like, no one ever said, hey, Cycles portal is the reason I'm not going to use the platform. And so given that was the general feedback of, hey, this makes it super easy, etc., we wanted to still kind of stick with how things happened in the past, but again, give it a kind of a fresh look at the same time. And we changed the underlying technology behind the portal. So the bigger thing is that building a feature that used to take maybe 2.5 weeks in the old portal, we're expecting we'll be able to get into the new portal within 3 to 4 days. So overall, it's going to be a significant development efficiency push as opposed to anything else.
So Bret was just answering a question that NSEEK just asked about self-hosted versus not self-hosted, and he answered that it's all self-hosted. But isn't the control plane hosted?
The control plane is hosted on our infrastructure, but where our customer infrastructure is, where user containers live, that's on their own infrastructure.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So it's kind of that kind of split divide, that hybrid approach.
Yeah. Good distinction. I'm out of questions.
I have a question. You started in Ohio. And you moved to Reno, Nevada. Yes. Why were you in Ohio, and what made you move to Nevada?
So I was born in Ohio.
Spent 25 years. Or do I have to read the article that's on your wall behind you? It looks like it says going west.
Yes, that is correct. But yeah, so it was born in Ohio, and I'd started the company when I was in Ohio. But back at the time, 2015, I was like, okay, do I really want to build a DevOps infrastructure company in Toledo, Ohio, like an area that's known for healthcare and automotive? Probably not the best place. And so we were looking for other places to move the company. And so we as a team, we flew out to Seattle, Austin, and Reno. And Reno had, very similar cost of living as, where I lived at in Ohio, but the same, not that way anymore, but it was at the time. And then it's like, okay, wow, I can get to Lake Tahoe, 30 minutes from my house. And there's just so many kind of happier, quality of life things here, like being able to sit here and look out the window and there's mountains, right? I could never go back to Ohio and just be surrounded by cornfields. Being close to the mountain, being close to Lake Tahoe, it was just so much of a happier place in terms of quality of life. And then at the same time, one of the ways that we've built our company that's a bit different than most in the industry is we have not taken any VC funding. Where most of our competitors have gone out and raised millions and millions of dollars in VC funding, Cycle has built our entire company off of revenue and angels. And so it's nice because we have 33 angels in the company today. 28 of them are either current or former founders. So instead of bringing in VC money, that was like, it's like everything is constantly like spend as much as you can, growth at all costs. Maybe you're going to die next year, but that's okay as long as you keep, as long as you put as much gas on the fire you can today. Cycle's all been, at the end of the day, our users don't care whether we're a super fast growing company or not. They want us to solve their problems, and they want us to not fail, right? And so one of the things that we have as a company that is super kind of foundational to who we are is we have a rule that we maintain a minimum of 2 years of cash at all times. And so that way, if something bad happens, we have plenty of time to adjust. And as we keep getting in front of bigger and bigger companies, that foundational belief of, hey, we're going to make sure that we don't fail, has become a very, very important point to these companies where maybe they've adopted a startup in the past and they're like, wow, this is great tech, but then they fail 4 months later, right? And then they have to go find a new technology or something. So with Cycle, our churn is 1.2%, right? Like once a company adopts Cycle, they don't leave. Again, we've put a lot of emphasis into making sure that that we're a company for our users as opposed to just chasing the next investment dollar.
Right.
So, sorry. The full circle there was Reno has a lot of angels. Reno is in terms of per capita, Reno has one of the highest net worths per capita in the country. It's all that Bay Area money with people not wanting to pay income tax on it.
And regarding your comment about proximity to Tahoe, I mean, I used to go to Tahoe at one point I was going to Tahoe quite a bit, but my favorite mountain there is mostly for the view on top is Mount Rose, and that's closer to Reno.
Yep. I mean, if I had a window in this corner here, it would be Mount Rose. So it's right over there. And it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Where did you live?
At the time I was living in San Francisco, but I had with like 7 friends, we rented a house in Truckee for a couple of winters, and so I'd basically spend the whole winter up there because I had a 2-wheel drive car, so I'd get up to the house, and then I'd be stuck for like 3 weeks.
That was one of the other interesting things about moving to this side of the country. Like I remember my first winter here, and I was driving, through Donner Pass, or driving. I was driving actually over to San Francisco, and I was getting ready to go through Donner Pass, and there's all these signs like, "Hey, pull over and put chains on your car." I'm like, what is this? Like, what, I have to put chains on my car? What are these? Like, I'm just used to cornfields. And so I had to go, in the middle of a snowstorm, buy chains and figure out how to put those on my tires just to make it over the mountains. And I didn't even know that was a thing before I moved here.
Yeah.
So
mountains are big. Snow's big.
Yeah. And you don't want to start slipping down it.
No.
There we go. That's the quote for the podcast. Mountains are big.
Yes.
You heard it here first, people. Well, this is great. I learned a lot today. Some refresher for me from the previous previous course, and now I'm going to have to say it again. We're going to have you back on the show after all this stuff is released, and we get even whatever we want to call it, Cycle 3.0 update on the podcast. But I really appreciate you being here, Jake.
Once we have the load balancer live, it's going to change a lot.
All right. Well, everybody figured it out. You can go to the website. You can skip the sales because you're on this podcast. You can reach out to Jake. Yeah, just send him an email. Jake, are you on Twitter? Can they reach out to you on Twitter?
Yeah, okay. Jake Warner.
Okay.
Yeah, reach out to me any way you want to, and we'll figure out how to get you an account if you really don't want to see a demo.
Right.
If you're watching this and you've already seen the demo that happened 20 minutes ago, just let us know and we'll let you in.
Right. Right. Engineers here, sometimes they're incompatible with salespeople, so I appreciate the skipping to the head of the line approach. Well, thank you so much. If you're watching this live, thanks for being here. Thanks for asking all the great questions. This becomes a podcast in like a month or so. And we will announce all that as well as any future shows. If you go up there and sign up for the newsletter, you get to find out who's going to be on the show, like Jake and everyone else. And next week, it's just going to be Matt and myself, and we're going to answer your questions about learning cloud native, about all these different tools in the ecosystem. We're here to help you. So that's all next week is going to be about. So come back and join us. After that, we've got backup Kubernetes stuff. We've got a bunch of people coming, including some of the founders of Kubernetes. So the whole summer is already jam-packed with guests, and we're excited to get to it. Sadly, Jake will not be back this summer, but we'll have him back on eventually to talk about new stuff as well. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time here on the live show. All right.